Okay, we're live.
All right. Good late afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the April 8th, 2021 meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee. Is there a motion to convene the meeting?
I make a motion to open the meeting.
Second. Any discussion on the motion? If there's no discussion, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is carried. The meeting is open. Good afternoon, everyone. Is there a motion to approve the minutes as edited, the minutes of April 1, 2021?
I make a motion.
I don't think I was present for that meeting, so I don't think I can make a motion.
I second the motion. Any discussion on the motion? If there is no discussion, all in favor of approving the minutes, please signify by aye or by hand.
Aye.
Aye.
The minutes are approved. Thank you, as always, Brian,
Thank
for a
you.
great job on those minutes. Nora, can you bring us up to date on the status of the ad hoc committee? And there is news.
Yes, I can. So the letter went out to all department. The letter from you all went out to all the department heads, and they were tasked with either forwarding it or giving a paper copy to all of their staff. And I think tomorrow the letter will go to all the volunteers via DMS. Which
And
means
that letter that went out a while ago, right?
I went out. I think it went out last week. I think that's when it went out.
Okay.
I think, and so HR sent it, and now it's in the queue for Power DMS, which means we should all, I don't know if I'll get it, but you should all get it, and that'll be confirmation that the boards and commissions got it.
Okay.
Signed up for Power DMS.
All right. Nora, thank you for pushing that through for us.
You're welcome.
Any questions or comments for Nora on that? If not,
In fact, it went out Friday, April 2nd. I have a copy.
good.
Nora, are all of the employees signed up with Power DMS?
I don't know if all the employees are, but this didn't go out. This didn't go out to the employees via Power DMS. It went out via the department heads.
No, I understand. I'm just kind of curious as to why.
I don't know if everybody has signed up. I think some people, I mean, I had trouble signing up the first time, so I'm not sure if there's 100% compliance in signing up, but that's the goal.
Okay.
Do we have confidence that the department heads will distribute this?
Yes.
Okay.
Do all the employees have an email?
You know, I think all the employees have an email, but I don't know, but I think some of them,
I don't think they all do. Most of them do, but some of them do not.
and I think some of them also, because they're not at a desk, they would get the paper copy. Just that's an easier way to communicate. So it's up to, I think the department heads know how to best communicate with their staff, and so it was left up to the department heads to make sure they got it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any further discussion on that? Okay, we'll go right to Trustee Natchez. Thank you for joining us at the meeting. And we are, as you know, we have been since October working on a revision of the Code of Ethics. We are very eager to solicit as many views as possible. We've heard from Nora along the way, from Tom Murphy, former members of the Ethics Board. We met with them in a group meeting. We met with Mark Ettinger individually and others who have contributed ideas, and we all want this to be as open a process as possible. So we are very interested in hearing your views. You are an elected official. The code is something that's certainly of concern to the board. So the open question I have, or we have for you, is are there provisions in the Code of Ethics that you believe require revision, omission? Are there any that require addition to the code? And any observations you have about how it works or doesn't work are most welcome.
Well, I first of all, I want to thank you all for giving of your time and being so masochistic to do all this. It's I'm sure when you all signed up, you did not think it would be this long or this complicated. But I applaud your efforts. Unfortunately, I've not been able to watch all your meetings live, but I have seen most of them, but not all of them through review. And I admire, your tenacity of going through it. I guess I have some specifics and some generals, observations, and what I'm hoping will come out of all the process. What has happened is, I think in the most recent past, is the ethics law has, I won't say not been followed, but I think has been abused. There are, anytime you write legislation, no matter how hard you work on it, there are always things that are subject to interpretation or things that you didn't think about, or, a situation that, doesn't quite fit into the box that was created. And you're trying to figure out how to handle it. The biggest concern that I have is talking to people about ethics boards and revisions. There seems, from my vantage point, I would hope it to become a more user-friendly approach, where the emphasis is not on I gotcha, but on education and help and assistance. There are very few cases that I can see, having been in this village for most of my life and following what's going on, that I thought were of what I would call a grievous or potentially a grievous situations. The code is very vague in a lot of things. And I don't know how you solve the vagueness totally. I've been giving a lot of thought to it. I don't have a total answer to it, but when we say can reasonably be assumed, I can reasonably assume something, and every one of you can reasonably assume something, and there could be 9 different visions of what is reasonable and what has been assumed. Part of it is by background, part of it is by training, part of it is by experience, and part of it is as what has been presented. And that gets to be a concern, and it gets to be a problem. Another is when you try for issues that come up that have a very short time determination as to whether there is a potential conflict or not. It's very hard to convene the committee. The committee will, or the ethics board, I guess, would meet. I don't know if it meets once a month or once a quarter. I don't know what their scheduled meeting is.
Once a month.
Once a month. So if you are on a committee or board that meets twice a month, it is conceivable that you might have something that arises within a couple of days of that meeting, and how you can get an opinion. I know that I've appeared before the committee on more than one occasion at their request. And what bothered me most about it was the committee didn't meet as a committee. It met as a subcommittee of one for interviews and discussions, and this had to involve other people where I was called to give my input to the extent that I had it. And several months later, when I actually got the information that was published regarding the interview, the difference between what was said and what was on paper was dramatically different. The person that was representing the committee had very strong opinions, and that was fine, and I don't object to that. But which that was used in terms of questions and answers did not track in terms of what actually was discovered or was actually discussed. I appeared with one other individual. And when I showed that to the other individual, he said, "Did I go to the same meeting you went to?" You know, it was quite dramatic.
So, excuse me, Dan, I'm sorry for interrupting. Are you saying you were never given the notes from that meeting to approve that it was captured correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay,
And we were told that everything was confidential and nothing was going to be given to anybody who, you know, and that was the ground rules that were set when I, you know, sat. So one of the recommendations would be,
I'm confused.
I'm sorry.
There was a subcommittee of one. The board met as a subcommittee of one.
Yep.
When was that?
Within the last 2 years, I don't remember the dates. I've only been on the board for 2 years. So it had to be, and it was shortly, the first interview was shortly after I came on the board, and the second interview was either towards the end of my first year or sometime in the middle of this second year. I can't remember. Both times the committee, quote, met as a subcommittee of one.
How could they even call a quorum to go into a subcommittee of one?
I don't want to get into specifics or names because I don't think that's relevant. It was a determination by whoever was running the show. And that bothered me. It didn't bother me that there was only one person until after I realized that things weren't being taken, you know, correctly in terms of what was written. We actually, when I went in, I actually told them that I wanted to record the meeting and recorded it. And then I was with somebody else. And then when we actually saw a paper that described it, it was dramatically different. But it doesn't make any difference. So to avoid things like that, I think if they're going to create, if the committee can't meet as a whole, then you should have at least 2 or 3 people to, you know, when they're interviewing people, so that there is not any particular individual's control.
Having sat on the board and actually been involved in drafting the legislation that created the current ethics board as it stands now, I don't believe it was ever anybody's anticipation or expectation that there would be a committee of one that would interview subjects or interview people in regard to an ethics issue. I'm shocked.
Not as shocked as I was.
And I don't understand how any member of any ethics board could think that that was an appropriate thing when the whole function of the ethics board is to operate, you know, among the members for them to participate in these issues, so that it is not specifically one person with their thumb on the scale or with a different interpretation. I'm just amazed. I can't believe that, honestly.
I would say conversely, if it's an interview, a fact-finding mission, at the least, if it's one person, Dan and whoever was with him should have had an opportunity to yay or nay what was documented as the substance of that interview.
I mean, I understand your point, but I think at the end of the day, the function of the ethics board is to work as a board.
Yep.
There are very strongly worded opinions from the state of New York that basically say that they can't meet individually. So I'm just amazed that any attorney for the ethics board would feel that that was an appropriate thing for them to do.
Yep.
I'm just amazed.
So continuing on in that vein, I would also suggest that somebody who is trying to seek information or, or guidance, and I think I emphasize the word guidance because I think that the ethics board needs to be proactive and sought for information and guidance as opposed to being in as some people have perceived it in a McCarthyism approach to life. And I think that's not a constructive approach for any community. Fortunately, we're not in a community that has a lot of problems in that regard. But even if we were, I'd be very concerned about that. I'd also am concerned that in the past, before I was on the board and after I was on the board, one person has been perceived as giving advice to people seeking advice or guidance, which I think is wrong. And I think that follows, on something that, John, you've just said. In continuing on that, there have been instances where the attorney guiding the board has been giving advice as to whether things are or are not a problem. And I don't believe that I don't think that the attorney for the ethics board should be the village attorney under any circumstances. I think there are too many potential problems of conflicts, but the attorney should not be, is there to provide guidance on a legal issue when requested and not be put in a position of trying to steer the committee. I believe that I would suggest that I don't believe there's a need or a meaningful desire to have the ethics board have the subpoena power. Some communities do, some communities don't. I think it sets a bad tone for people who are trying to do the right thing and to seek guidance, and be proactive as opposed to in a negative setting. And I think that helps set a negative tone type of thing.
Dan,
Go ahead,
could I
Mike.
just ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Just for the trustee, Dan Natchez. So with the subpoena power, and I recognize we're talking about providing guidance, and I think that's important, but should they get involved in an investigation, how would they compel information? And wouldn't that result in a dead end if they couldn't use a subpoena? And also, I should have prefaced with it, we heard information from somebody who described the process and the lack of secrecy, which I found alarming myself. So I recognize that there are problems there, and I recognize the power of the subpoena, but I just get concerned. How would you have them do investigations with people who might not be forthcoming?
Well, the assumption in your statement is that they wouldn't be forthcoming. The subpoena power was used recently with people who were forthcoming. And in writing, in the report that was filed by the Ethics Committee, without naming names, it said they were used because they believed they were not forthcoming. And that in and of itself bothers me because that then sets a bad tone. But you raise an interesting question. My answer is, I don't believe that an ethics committee made up of well-meaning citizens either has enough training or to act in that type of problematic situation. And the ethics board has the ability to turn it over to authorities that would have that power. And therefore, it seems to me that our friendly village, to keep it friendly, wants to set a tone and an approach. And should they run into a stone wall, they have the ability to say, we think something may not be correct, but we don't have the power to do this. We now turn this over to whomever we think would have that jurisdiction. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And
Thank you.
But I will admit that I don't have a full knowledge of the whole, of all sides of it. If we were in a era where Tammany Hall was, predominant, but I don't think that's what we have in this village. But, maybe you need it, but I would prefer not, because I think there's another alternative with those who are trained to be able to pursue it. Again, the ethics board is made up of volunteers, in the committee. The board of trustees is charged with selecting those people whom we think, would be helpful and would have guidance approaches, and as opposed to political agendas. I would hope that that prevails. We could have times when it doesn't. People are human and we have to deal with whatever we have to deal with. But even in those situations, the subpoena power would be worse than anything else. At least that's how I view it. I think we also have a question of who's governed by the code of ethics, or I sort of read some of the stuff that you've been dealing with, but I'll give you the interesting issue is, are volunteers covered by this? And I raised that because I don't know, you can define it many different ways, but a good example is our fire department are all volunteers, with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 people who actually get compensation for services rendered. So those people would be considered employees or consultants, or fit into one of those categories. But the vast number are both the fire department and EMS are volunteers. And the question is, should they be covered? Should they not be covered? Those are things to do. The biggest issue is, from my vantage point of the code, is its vagueness. And I don't know how you totally solve the vagueness, but you can come up with various scenarios that, that might be given as examples, not as absolutes, and saying, if this occurred and this type of situation occurred, perhaps guidance could be, is needed versus not. And I think those are types of things that happen. I'll give you a concern that I had, without getting into the specifics. And I know that others in other situations and other boards and committees have had, where they have, prior to their being part of the village family, worked for or had a relationship with a particular property or family or individual. And they also have tremendous knowledge that has nothing to do with that property, you know, or family or whatever. And an issue comes up that has a much broader implication for village policy. You know, should they recuse themselves? And they, you know, and deprive the village of their input on a broader level or not? It's a very interesting question, which goes back and forth. I took a conservative approach and recused myself on one of those issues when it was within the 2-year period. I think the village did not have a lot of information that I could have provided in my knowledge of things in my profession, as opposed to a particular, you know, individual or site. And I think I think I've seen that happen in more than one case with people who serve on boards. And I think that stifles the village from being able to take a holistic view of things on a policy basis. You know, I don't know whether, you know, I should have recused or shouldn't recuse, but I did. After the 2-year period, I did not recuse myself. When a similar issue on that, came up. As a result, the village, I think, did a much better job in coming to grips with the matter that was in front of them, that was not presented as a policy issue, but actually turned into a policy issue and a monetary issue for the village, not for any individual property owner. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I'm just trying to give you my, thoughts as randomly as it comes to me. I'm a big believer in ethics. I believe that I'm an open book. I will tell you, in one of the meetings that I had with the ethics board, I was asked who I spoke with or discussed things with. And I refused to answer that question because I have an open door policy as a trustee that anybody wants to talk to me or tell me something, I'm happy to listen, but I'm not going to reveal who said what about whom or played that game. To the extent that factual information can be synthesized out of that, I would be happy to use that, but I don't get into, who said what, when, where, because that's not me, was not meaningful to the matter that was at hand. So, what I think, and that's why I say, I think if you had more than one person, during interviews, that type of misstep can be avoided.
Any questions for Dan Natchez?
Yeah, I had a question. Something the committee's debating about is the statute of limitations on potential violations. How do you feel about that?
It's a good question, Brian. I've never even thought of it. I guess, I don't know. I'll tell you my immediate reactions, if it is a monetary thing, I'm not sure that I would have a statute of limitations. We have a statute of limitations for 2 years after. Well, this is a good one. That raises an interesting question, Brian. So forgive me for rambling. The statute says that you can't represent anybody for 2 years after you've served. Okay. It is silent on 2 years beforehand. The village's form for disclosure, it says 2 years. There are, from what I understand from legal opinions that the village has gotten on specific cases, that the 2-year prior governs. I don't know. I think that should be cleared up one way or the other. I think that if somebody has been dipping into the till, I'm not sure that there should be a statute of limitations.
Right, but is that actually a code of ethics violation or some other definitely a violation, but
If it's I guess I'm getting to the distinction between criminal and non-criminal.
right. But to me, code of ethics is, well, I'm about to say something and then unsay it, but that's much more of a behavioral thing, but dipping into the till is also behavioral. So,
No, but one is it where you're creating, when you have committed a crime, knowingly or otherwise, there are laws that govern the statute of limitations. State laws, federal laws. I don't know that the village needs to get into that. One of the things that we keep, if you're on the Board of Ethics and you discover something that you think is significantly egregious in a violation of a law, if I were on the Board of Ethics, I would be concerned, and would turn it over to those who are better able to handle both an investigation and a determination and a pursuit of what should be done. I don't think that that's a role that village volunteers, as well-meaning as they are, should be placed in that position to do so. If it's not a criminal thing, then that's a whole different matter. It is, it is a behavioral approach, if you will, to use your words, Helen.
thanks.
And then there's this middle gray area that we seem to end up in on a lot of things, but who knows? But that's an interesting question. But so that's one of the things you need to clear up is the before, because the code is actually silent. It's not silent on the after.
Well, let's say, for example, and this is going to be a stupid example, but it gets more to behavioral versus criminal. You're on the Board of Trustees and you're going to be voting on something, and someone involved in that something has been giving you gifts, sent you on a vacation, did whatever. You're no longer a trustee, and it's 3 years after the fact, and someone brought this to the attention of the Board of Ethics. Is there a statute of limitations on that? You're no longer in office. Your gift taking was when you were in office.
Well, I'd turn that question somewhat on its head and say, is it right to bring an action and wait years later? Some statutes, I believe, address upon discovery and some address upon occurrence. But we can have a discussion about this as a committee, of course, but I am troubled about an action being brought years after it could have been brought. And this is the board only is investigating civil matters. They don't have criminal prosecutorial authority.
Right.
So I probably would tend to agree with you, Dan, but that raises a very interesting question that has happened on more than one occasion in the last 8 years, where a person has been involved in suggesting that there might have been something done wrong, either formally or informally. and later been put in a position of having to review things, I would think that there should be an automatic recusal if somebody has been involved in any way, shape, manner, or form from the initiation through a determination for being part of any review, period. So let me give you an example. If I think that John Jones should recuse themselves on a particular application in the land use board and call somebody in a position of power to make that suggestion, and that person does not recuse themselves, and that it gets into a involved process, and that person could be in a period, in one of several periods of review, depending on what level it is. I don't think, in that they've not been formally involved, but they were involved in the process. They should not be sitting on it. That, to me, would be a very significant conflict of interest. Yet there are cases where that has happened and it's in the record. And I think that more than anything else bothers me. Because if you're trying to say the ethics committee is trying to put people on the right road, then everybody involved has to be on that right road.
So are you saying this happened with someone who was on the ethics board?
I'm saying that there are people that have been involved, some maybe on the ethics board and maybe not on the ethics board. I don't want to give names because I don't think that's constructive, but specifics I will be happy that person A calls person B in a position of authority and says, I think this is wrong. That person should recuse themselves on a particular application, in the land use board. Then maybe be in a position of having to either, if they're on the board reviewing it or having to review other things, part of it. I think that's totally wrong.
I think we're probably all agreed with you on that. The issue I thought we were discussing was the statute of limitations. So
I'm not talking about statute of limitations. I'm
okay.
talking about during the actual process.
All right.
And
I think we're
in the last
with
few
you.
years, there's been a couple of cases that come to mind. And the record, if you read the records carefully, they can be discerned. No,
Okay.
but
Well, we are.
I'm not suggesting there was malice of anything, or that person may or may not, had a personal, grudge against somebody. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about, even if it's innocently, if they've been part of the process of making or having a complaint initiated, they're part of any part of the process from beginning to end.
I think we're agreed with you on that, and you took a page from the lawyer's code of professional responsibility. One should avoid even the appearance of impropriety or of a conflict of interest. So this is always a judgment call when it comes to someone who is in a decision-making position on a board or a committee. We can't write that into the code of ethics unless we wanted to, took a page from the code of professional responsibility and use that phrase. But I kind of think it's implicit, if not explicit, in when one is sitting on a public board of some kind.
I would suggest it might be good to lift that.
It might, what, I'm sorry?
Might be good to lift that and put something like that in the code, because it's happened on more than one occasion. And think everybody was well-meaning, but I got to tell you, the optics of it, from my view, and fortunately, I'm not involved in that. But the optics, from my view, were not good. You know, and I don't think that, you know, we need to get into that type of situation, you know, and the repercussions from that type of situation. You know,
I mean, Dan, I understand your point, I think. But I think part of our situation is, as a ad hoc committee, our recommendation is that no investigation or process can start unless there's a written request from somebody.
I understand that, but let me give you a scenario. Okay, John, you're on the Board of Trustees.
Yes.
Okay. I'm John Q. Citizen. Okay. Oh, no, let's put it the other way. You're on the Board of Trustees. I'm, you know, I'm on the Ethics Board. Okay. Ellen has an application in front of her, or that she submitted. And for whatever the reason you believe that is incorrect, and call me or call somebody else to tell them that, you know, there's a potential ethics issue. I actually phrased the scenario wrong, but the result is the same. You would not be part of the formal accusation.
I see what you're saying.
And I'm saying that if, you know, if the investigation and testimony shows that there has been a, you know, that you were involved, even if it was for the best of intentions, you know, and it came to the Board of Trustees, you know, to adjudicate, you know, you shouldn't be part of it, and you shouldn't be part of it at all, you know, type of thing. The other thing is that we don't seem to have in the last 2 years, but we did for many years before that. If there is an ethics complaint and the ethics board believes that there should be either an investigation or a review to determine whether an investigation needs to be done, one of the first things they should do is bring the person in and ask them about it, either formally or informally, however they believe is the best approach to life. That does not happen. And what happens is the ethics board seems to form a mindset and then talks to somebody. And what I have learned in my short time on this planet, that there are always two sides to how people view things. Doesn't mean one side is better or the other, but it is, rather than having a mindset created without discussing it openly with somebody that is being potentially in an issue, doesn't make sense in my mind. I mean, I've been in, you know, with large corporations and small corporations. And if any time that there was an issue, the first thing I would do as a manager is talk to that person. So I have an understanding of where that person was coming from, even if they're trying to cover something up. It gives me a better vantage point of how to try and evaluate where to go on something. And I believe that is transferable to the ethics committee. And I think that should be part of whatever the revision should be.
Can you be more specific as what should be part of the revision?
Say again, I'm sorry.
You said that should be part of the revision.
Yes.
So my question is, what is it specifically that should be part of the revision?
That if a complaint is lodged, and as I understand it, you're recommending, if I understood what you're saying, John, is you're recommending a, formal complaint.
Yeah, I mean, I do see the point that you're making. I speak to somebody who speaks to somebody who files a formal complaint. It doesn't capture the trail of how this was initiated. I appreciate that.
Okay, well, that's one part of it. The other part is,
And I appreciate the part that you're saying about, so if I initiate it, then I should certainly be recused.
or part of the
participating.
trail,
Yeah.
or part of the, what I would call the communication trail.
Right.
But to answer Dan's question, I believe that if you're either doing an informal or a formal complaint review, however that manifests itself, that one of the first things you should do after getting the complaint is also talking to that individual.
So you're talking about really complaint to the Board of Ethics or the Ethics Board.
Yes.
To say, talk to the individual, it can't be anything less, I think, than the board formally convening and talking to that individual.
I would agree. Absolutely.
And that's, all right.
But Dan Carson, to that point that Dan Natchez made earlier, a meeting of a subcommittee with anybody with the Board of Ethics just seems incredibly odd to me. I don't know how you can hear testimony or understand a problem or take any action without a quorum being present.
I understand that, but what I'm trying to pursue
I think there's two things to pursue. I mean, I think the idea that the ethics board can create a subcommittee of one to have a conversation with a prospective with either a witness or somebody who's the subject of an ethics request or claim or investigation. It just seems, so counterintuitive to the whole reason that an ethics board is created.
Well, that's my question is, if Dan Natchez's, I can't speak for him, but if his suggestion is that before there is a full-blown investigation and hearing, it sounds like he's saying before you do that, talk to the individual. And if that's the process, it still has to be before a formal meeting of the board.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
But you'd have to have a formal meeting of the board to determine that there was something to undertake, correct?
Right.
I call you, Dan, and I say, I have a problem, with John Jones. And you say, put it in writing and submit it. Okay, I submit it. You as the ethics board will bring everybody together. I'm just using you as an example now.
Mm-hmm.
And you discuss it. One of the first things that that should be determined from there is to bring the person, if they believe there is something to investigate or to find out more information on. I don't like the word investigate because it assumes that there's a problem. But, that to go further,
Inquire.
determine whether there is an issue to investigate. I would bring that person in and talk to them. That doesn't mean that you're going to believe them or not believe them, but at least you don't, when you finally get to see that person, you're not with a negative mindset.
Mm-hmm.
If you do an investigation and say, we believe Jocelyn has done something that really needs to be investigated, and then we ask Jocelyn to come in, there's nobody in that room that is going to say, Jocelyn, we have an open mind. They may say it, but they don't mean it because they've already been exposed to a negative approach. That's why Jocelyn's before them. So the issue is, here's something that has been said, give us some insight. And then, we can determine where to go from there. Jocelyn may have a great story, may have a lousy story, but at least there is there is the ability to communicate before a mindset has been created that is a negative to whoever is being accused of something.
It also provides a fully documented audit trail of what potentially may have gotten you to a total investigation.
So I'm a big believer in openness and transparency.
Yep.
And that's where I'm coming from. I understand that not everybody may be receptive to that, and many times it's very hard to figure out how to put that into a structure, in a formal structure, in writing to do so. But that's where I'm coming from.
Okay. Any other questions for Trustee Natchez? If not,
I do, Dan. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Dan, I've asked this to most of the people who've come before us. Do you think that this should be a volunteer board? And, based on your, input today, do you think maybe that this should be a volunteer board and that certain parts of it could be subbed out to other professional people?
I think the
Such
answer
as
to that is yes. I think I backed myself into it in my examples. If you're talking about a criminal thing, volunteers aren't equipped to handle something like that. If something is significantly egregious, I'm not sure they're equipped to do that either. But for most of the things that would come before the board, and I think it goes back to why do we have the ethics board in the first place? My view is its largest responsibility is education and guidance on a proactive basis, not on a negative, we have a problem, we're going to try and, take somebody and make them pay a penalty. That's not my approach to life. Sometimes you have to be there. So that's not quite answering your question specifically, but it gives you a vantage point. I think the ethics committee or the ethics board can be volunteer and can handle most of the things that would become before the village. But there may be cases where things are really hairy, and I don't think the ethics board should be dealing with them, period. And the code allows them to, if you want, punt on the 20-yard line and give it to somebody, who's better equipped to handle it. And I think that type of structure works. And it also, if you think about it, avoids Article 78 by somebody who believes that it was not properly handled. And then, which then costs the village a lot of money. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where I'm coming from.
No, thanks, Dan. It gets to it. We've asked this of everybody who came before us.
No, it's a good question. And you people are doing I've watched your meetings. I've watched you, how you debate things and are concerned. You're a very thoughtful committee, more so than most. And my hat's off to you if I wore a hat.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? If there are none, Dan Natchez, you are welcome to stay and continue to observe the stay and comment as you see fit as we continue our discussion.
If you don't mind, I'll stay for a little while, but then I have other meetings that I have to run from other committees.
Got it. Okay.
You also have an email from me to answer, Dan.
Okay, I will get to it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. I'm going to go to the agenda now, and it's our continued discussion on the code section, and I would like you to refer to the notes that I distributed yesterday for today's meeting. And I'm going to, I had put this off because there were not 6 of us at the last meeting, and now we have 6 of us. And I would like to discuss the statute of limitations. We started a discussion on that. I think the 1 or 2 of you who did research on this found that it is absent from other codes of ethics. And we've had an extended discussion on this. So our choices are we can apply a statute of limitations. And if we do, we would have to define it insofar as a date, either a date from when an act could reasonably have been discovered, or strictly a date of occurrence, or we can continue to have the code be silent to this. And there may be a point of view that it's the Mamaroneck Code of Ethics, we don't need it, or it's the Mamaroneck Code of Ethics and we should have something that so specifies when an action for a violation of the code occurs. Jocelyn, you have your hand up.
Just a question. So in having this discussion, and just because I just don't know, are we talking about a statute for things that happen after or before and after? Because I think to Dan's point earlier, so I understand we can opt to be silent and then it doesn't matter. But are you suggesting that a statute of limitations is for after their time on the board, or after an event, or just I'm curious how this.
It's transactional.
Okay.
Village of Mamaroneck employee wrongfully accepts a benefit of some kind, a gratuity of $5,000, fully paid vacation, and no one learns about that for, let's say, and then departs service from the village, and clearly the Board of Ethics can bring an action for violation. The question is, when can the Board of Ethics not bring such an action? Is it if no one finds out about it for 4 years or 5 years, can the board bring an action then? Is it fair to, or must it be within a certain period of time?
Right, so that one is more well known to me, but how about before someone becomes an employee, they accept that same $5,000? Is that ordinarily something where it's once you become, you're not subject to a code prior, you're only subject to the code once you become an employee or a consultant? So I feel we can kind of define it from the point they become a village employee, or how we've defined the code covers, and just talk about that going forward, whether it should be, we should be silent or not. Because I think.
Right, but I'm sorry, Jocelyn, but to that point, should we take a look at the disclosure statement and see if something should be covering that scenario?
But I think
So
Jocelyn
before.
is saying, I think unless I'm mistaken, I think what Jocelyn is saying is employee accepts the $10,000 gratuity before the person is
Yep.
required to disclose, or before it becomes a violation. And I think by law, if you took the gratuity, the benefit, and the law did not affect you, or did not, you were not covered by the law, then no action can be brought. It has to be, you have to have violated the code while you were a covered person.
I agree.
Now the question is, 3 years have elapsed, 5 years have elapsed, 10 years have elapsed.
But I think there's two things here. One is the violation of the code per se, like in the instance that you said. The other is, as Ellen said, the disclosure. I received a $10,000, gift from, the builder of the next building on Mamaroneck Avenue, and I'm an engineer. I'm now the village engineer. How do you get at that?
And to me, I think that's important, and it gets to Dan Natchez's statements on transparency.
Well, I think you
It
get to
may
that.
not be a violation, but you're just putting all your cards on the table.
I think you get to that is if you are not covered by the law, you accept the benefit. Next year, you are covered by the law. If you are confronted with a situation where a decision is called for because you are the village engineer, then you have to disclose because you have had a relationship with the party. So I think that's covered.
Right, and no, I don't know that it's covered because I don't know that that employees or board members see it that way.
Well, then that's why you have the board, and the board can make a determination. And if
Okay.
the board rules against you, you can be fined, and then you can bring a proceeding to overturn it.
Right,
the
but what
board's-
I think it's a rarity of an issue, you know, the kind of issue that we're talking about. But I could imagine that in a scenario where a engineer had previously done work for a contractor and received a bonus, or, you know, they heard that he was going to be becoming the village engineer, and they decided to give him a nice Christmas gift. You know, that could happen, and that in and of itself isn't a violation. It only becomes a violation after the fact when that person is an applicant and
Right.
and has to appear before him.
That's correct.
But I think we need to make sure that the disclosure statement, and I don't remember the specifics of it, so it might already be there, covers X amount of time prior. Because your example, John, I'm going to become the village engineer on May
And
1st.
I'm not suggesting that this has ever occurred. I know that these meetings are public, and I just don't want anybody to feel like I'm picking on the engineer.
Right, but we don't have one, so it's okay. But
Yeah.
I'm going to become the village engineer on May 1. And on January 1, you know, a developer gave me a Happy New Year's present and sent me on a vacation. Does that need to be disclosed? Just for full transparency.
I think
Yes.
there again, the appearance of an impropriety, if yes, I think
Yep.
one could say that, but we're off the topic. The topic is a statute of limitations.
Can-
And let's assume there's a violation. Let's assume there's a violation.
Can-
Should the Board of Ethics have or the village have a time limit when it can bring an action, or do we leave it open-ended?
Dan, can I say, I think in previous meetings, we talked about the referral process going to a dedicated prosecutor, right? And just correct me if I'm wrong, I think we all talked about it going to Westchester County first, right? Why not just follow the penal law as it comes to statute of limitations? So a village employee, in essence, is an official, I don't know what the term is. It's a government official, so that the statute of limitations would be their time frame plus, depending on the type of crime, right? And so that could fall into place there. And I think the problem we're getting to is how far out should somebody be punished? I would break it down, say there's no statute of limitations as it comes to identifying what happened. Doesn't mean somebody's going to be punished, but I think the public has a right to know if there's been potential misconduct, what happened. And I think that somebody who might be accused of something has the right to have its village determine, no, nothing did happen. So I'd like to see what is the board's feeling on that. Just forgetting about sanctions, that there should be some effort to determine was there misconduct or not.
But when
Regardless
do
of the
they
time frame.
determine it? If it's 5 years later, is it fair? The village can, the Board of Ethics can make a finding, but they can't impose a penalty if there's if it passes the statute of limitations. So if we want the Board of Ethics to have enforcement authority and the law to have teeth, and do we say after the authority is unlimited, they can investigate 5 years, 10 years?
I think that they should make some attempt. If I was accused of misconduct in the village, I'd like to know that somebody took some action to clear me of this matter.
They
right?
can investigate. It's
Right,
the
that's what I'm saying.
question.
I just think that they should have that responsibility to look into this matter and say, this is what we determine happened. Now, it gets more difficult as time goes on, but I think that the residents of the village are entitled to have knowledge as to what transpired on an allegation, getting about sanctions,
But that's in the code. They can do that.
as long as forever.
I see, there's nothing that bars them from doing it. But right now, what there is no bar to the village imposing a penalty.
But when we, okay, I don't want it to be misconstrued that because there's no penalty, there's no need to do an investigation. Determine what happened.
If you create a statute of limitations, the Board of Ethics is not barred from conducting a fact-finding inquiry if you have a statute and the statute has not been told or has lapsed, then they can't impose a penalty. So my question to the committee is, should there be a time at which the bell tolls, and while the ethics board can conduct an investigation, it can no longer punish someone if they find that there has been a violation?
I think it should be an open question because I don't think anyone has raised it before. And if they do, I think the court should decide the matter.
So that means that if you bring a proceeding 10 years after the act has occurred and you find the individual involved, that person's remedy then is to bring an Article 78 proceeding and say that the village has acted outside of its authority.
Yeah, I agree.
Other codes are silent. Is that what we like? I don't know who did the research, but
Yeah,
Good.
they're all silent. The ones that Ellen sent over,
okay.
Yep.
I think a few months ago, they were all silent. They had no statute. They didn't even address the
I
question.
think the thing we're missing here is, ethics codes can only cover employees and board members. My understanding is while they are employees and board members.
Really?
Yeah. I think the article that I sent you kind of outlines that, I believe. Maybe, let me read through it and I'll
Right, but John, to that point, if I'm no longer an employee, do I really care what the Village of Mamaroneck Code of Ethics is?
Well, I think that goes back to Dan and Mike's point regarding there are other appropriate places to pursue something if there's true illegal or inappropriate action, was taken. There are other ways to pursue this. Ethics boards are, I believe, only supposed to be employees and board members and officers, not outside of that. I'll find it. I read through the article last week and read through it again a couple of days ago, and I'm pretty sure it just it basically outlines that it's not, not for other parties. So I don't know how you. I'll find it.
Oh, where are you?
I'm trying to. Pardon?
I'm trying to put the code up. I thought I had it. I have it here.
And Dan, while you're finding it, I just want to go back to what you said about the board's ability to go and do that. And, I would ask this board, I would like to see something like that recommended to the Board of Trustees to recognize, right? So that they don't forget that they have that opportunity to identify what happened, right?
Oh, yeah. Yikes. Well, I thought I could get the code up. I'm having trouble again. When I put the share screen, do you guys see all my windows?
No, we see what you share.
Only what I share. I hope so.
Oh, now I'm curious.
You'd be bored.
He probably has so many codes of ethics on his screen. He's like, oh, let me look at another one today.
All right, New York State municipal law.
Oh, so
Ooh.
exciting.
There we are. All right, I found it. Yeah, well, you'd see my Spotify with my old Beatles songs and
Oh, that's cool.
okay. So having then diverted you all, is there, and having heard these many points of view, is there, I'm just going to take a straw poll here. How many of you believe that there should be a time limit, in effect, a statute of limitations for to be put into the code? If you believe a statute of limitations should be inserted in the code, please signify by raising your hand. So
I've got 1 foot in, 1 foot out, so I don't know how to vote. What-
you only get one vote, though.
I'm moving with Ellen. I think Ellen is right. Again, I go back to what I said. I see no harm in allowing or recommending or putting in the word so that they know that they can investigate a matter for as long as necessary. If we want the sanctions, I could live with. I don't have a problem with saying sanctions have a time limit, and I would recommend we follow the New York State penal law that has the specifics right in it.
All right. So if I can narrow the question, if I said to you that the statute of limitations will not bar from speaking, I believe correctly as a lawyer, the statute of limitations does not bar the ethics board from conducting a civil inquiry into a prior act. The statute of limitations would only prohibit the ethics board from imposing a penalty. For that narrow question as to whether there should be a statute of limitations, please raise your hand whether you think there should be a statute of limitations. So I see myself, Ellen, John, Mike. Okay, now, if there is to be a statute of limitations, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years. Are there any thoughts on that?
I think we should open up the penal law and just figure out what corresponds with the law that's in place.
I will look at that and come back to you with some examples of New York State law and the various SOLs and how they apply to different laws.
But Dan, can I
Yes.
can I ask a question though? I mean, Mike is working under the assumption that everything that gets referred to the ethics board will be determined. There will be a determination on everything that gets presented to the ethics board. Right? I mean, I ultimately that going to Mike's example of a person who was unfairly, has an ethics charge brought against them, and they want to clear their name after the fact, say 2 years after the fact. We're assuming that the ethics board is looking into everything that gets referred to them and doing the same level of job on everything that gets referred to them, correct?
Okay.
I'm asking, I'm asking that question. I mean, there's no discretion. We're making the assumption there is no discretion by the ethics board not to look into an ethics charge, correct?
I mean, they have to look into something. Like, they have to read what the complaint is. They can't just, oh, here's a piece of paper and throw it in the trash can. Like, there has to be some level of review. It doesn't have to go to
And
the
documents
every time.
No, I'm just, I mean, I'm trying to get a better understanding, because I mean, I think the only way that we get to the heart of what Mike is talking about is if that's the case. And if that's the case, if everything that gets referred to the ethics board has to get investigated or reviewed or determined or whatever, some sort of decision has to be made on it, then I'm okay with that. If they are going to be given the discretion of looking into this, but not looking into that, then I'm concerned, because then there's the opportunity for the ethics board to be used as a weapon.
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand what your point is, John, but I think what a statute of limitation does is, in effect, prevent, to some extent, the ethics board from being used as an instrument of retribution. Because you're saying you can't go back and hound or harass somebody for something that took place years ago.
No, I think what Mike is saying, there are in some cases, in some cases, it may be more reputational damage than financial.
Well,
And I'll be very honest. I served on the ethics board on the village board more than 10 years ago. Hypothetically, somebody could come out of the woodwork and say, "Oh, by the way, create some sort of ethics issue to have the ethics board investigate, drum up some, made up thing, and then the ethics board could sit there and not investigate it, right? Or not do a diligent job investigating it."
is your question whether the ethics board should be also, if there were a statute of limitations, should the ethics board then be barred from actually investigating the issue, the underlying issue?
No, what I am saying is, are we working under the assumption that the ethics board will investigate and review everything that gets referred to it in a consistent and fair manner, or do they have discretion to not investigate certain things?
Oh, that's another question entirely, I think.
But I think that gets to the heart of what Mike is getting to. You're on mute, Mike.
I'm sorry. I think to the fact that anything that comes before the ethics board, I think we've all discussed this, should be logged in some capacity, and then the discretion from that point, how much effort do they deem is necessary to put into this? And then ultimately, they're held accountable by the board of trustees. They do their due diligence or not. I just feel that any matter that comes in, there should be some record of it, and the board should weigh in on it in some fashion or another. Now, if I can, John, and I don't want to use you, but if a trustee from 10 years ago, right, if somebody went to the board, really how much effort should go into that, and it really depended on the type of, and we leave it to their discretion to figure that out. But
Right.
I just don't think it's brushed under the rug.
No, I
agree with you.
completely agree. I just, what I don't want is there to be no, we don't want the ethics board to be weaponized in any way. We want them to do a fair and honest review of the issues. And in particular cases where, like going back to Ellen's, scenario of her not liking the color of my shirt, so she files an ethics claim against me because she finds the color of my shirt offensive. The ethics board meets once, basically says there's nothing to this, keeps a record of it, and moves on. I get it. To me, that's there are always going to be those kinds of instances where somebody makes a claim, but it can't be. But the ethics board has to, like you said, log and carry those pieces forward, even if they're insane and mundane and ridiculous.
Right, but
so
I
that
think,
there's a record of them.
right, John, if we look at some of the changes we're proposing, is that all things before the ethics board have to be put in writing.
Right.
And they're going to meet once a month, or if they need to do special meetings, in between. And those meetings are minuted and recorded. So there's full, and boy, I must have really upset you a couple of months ago.
No,
and I said,
no,
"You don't
no.
like the color of your
I mean, I
shirt."
thought, given that I'm wearing a bright orange shirt, I figured it would be a good
Yeah.
example.
But we'll go back to the color of your shirt. So I submit something, they have to acknowledge it during their monthly meeting.
Right.
And hopefully they don't say this crazy lady has an issue with the shirt color. But if that's what it is, that's what it is. It gets documented and it gets put to bed.
Right.
Yeah, I think, John, you've actually carried the day here in the point of view you expressed 2 weeks ago. And I have now edited the code, and I think I've made it very clear that there aren't going to be any more binding oral opinions by anybody.
Right.
So I think we're there. And of course, we
Sure.
have to have some faith that this committee of volunteer citizens is going to act responsibly.
Right. And I will say that the 2-year thing that we put in the ethics law, the current edition of the ethics law, was to prevent people from basically consulting for the village and then coming to work for the village. You know, working as a contract consultant and then coming to work for the village, you know, like on a land use issue, like they were a consultant on, you know, on a large development project that was before many of the land use boards. And then, you know, they turn around and then they're working for the village. That was what was, you know, some of what the concern was, that you now have somebody who had been appearing before planning boards and zoning boards, you know, working in the building department or the planning department.
Okay, let me just, it's 6:22. I thank you all for attending and hanging in there for this long meeting. We turn into a pumpkin at 6:30. Nora, as the host, has to cut us off. So I want to be very mindful of the time so we don't lose the record of what we're discussing. So I'm going to give us 5 more minutes of meeting, and then I think we're going to call it a meeting. So Nora can, and there'll be a few seconds more for any final comments. Then Nora can log us off.
All right, so Dan, one of the other things that we discussed last week, but didn't have John and Jocelyn and wanted their opinion was, if you have a question, do you go to the Board of Ethics or do you go to the village attorney? It can't be an either or. And based on what the village attorney told us, his opinion's not binding.
Right. But how do we put that in? I think we've addressed it, Ellen, in the sense that we've made clear that if you want a binding opinion on ethics, you've got to go to the Board of Ethics. If you can't go to the village attorney, you're not going to get an official opinion from the village attorney or an individual board member.
No, I agree with you, but I think we kind of left that somewhat open because John at the meeting prior thought it was fine to go to the village attorney. So we didn't want to close that out. So, you know, in terms of me, where I volunteered to do a process map, so I have a complaint, I go here, you know, or I have a question, we need to know, who do we tell village employees to go to? It can't be an either or.
For expediency, to me, it is the village attorney. And if it becomes an issue, if the employee or the board member has an issue, doesn't like the answer, then they can go to the ethics board.
Right, but John, if I'm an employee and I'm seeking guidance, can I do A or B? Or can I do A? And
No, I don't think you can do, you know, you can always go to the ethics board with a written,
No, let me finish, John. If I need guidance and I go to the village attorney and he tells me it's okay to do something, I'm gonna go ahead and do it. And down the road, there's an issue, and it becomes clear that the village attorney's opinion is not binding. So I, as an employee, have been misled while trying to do the right thing.
I think the village attorney's options are, it's clear that this is the answer, no problem. There's unsettled law on this, I'm not sure, you should really go to the ethics board. Or the answer is no, it's clear litigation, there are clear issues on this, and the answer is no, but again, it's not binding, so if you want to go to the ethics board, you can go to the ethics board.
John, I hear what you're saying, and I'd like to create something that has an attorney involved in providing guidance. I think we could all agree with that. I just don't want the attorney to be in a role over the board, right? And so, why have a board if the attorney is making decisions? And then if it's not binding, how valuable is it?
I don't think, the day-to-day stuff that the attorney is going to be asked on a regular basis are things that, are things that they, should be, they're time-sensitive things, where somebody who's sitting on a board or a commission, if they have to wait for the ethics board to meet, they are now sitting out of meetings.
Okay, so now,
get it.
all right, John, I'm sorry, Mike, but let's
Go
go
ahead,
down
Ellen.
a different path. We've already stated that the ethics board has to document everything. The requests have to come in writing, no more phone calls, it all has to be documented. Are we now saying the village attorney, we haven't addressed that. The village attorney also has to document everything? Because then it's a he said, she said.
No, it's not a he said, she said. It's a he said situation.
Well, okay,
The
but you know what
attorney
I'm
told
saying.
me that it was okay.
And
This
it's
is an honest
not-
mistake. This is
and
an
it's
honest
not
mistake.
But it's not documented. It's not protected.
But it would be documented. Every attorney, the attorneys that we work, that the village has working for them, document what they do for the village in 15-minute increments.
Right, but do they record the
Spalzino has-
results of a phone call?
I think Bob Spalzino has said that he handles informal inquiries and does not make such a record.
Exactly.
Well,
Didn't
then
he also
that's
say
for the
that that's not his?
village board to enforce.
Look, folks, we have to call it a night. It's 6:28, and we're gonna just get cut off at 6:30. So
No.
I'm sorry to cut it off at such a very interesting point, but we should give this thought because it's a very difficult issue. So I'm going to put it on the agenda early for next week, and please give this some thought. I think it's one of the toughest issues we are facing. So thank you all. Is there and I'm going to start to shove this through, but is there a motion to adjourn?
Make a motion.
Second,
Second,
any discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor, please signify.
I,
Thank you. The motion is carried. We're adjourned. Thank you very much. This was a great meeting and look forward to seeing you. Not you, John. I think you're doing your college tour.
I probably will be there because I had to postpone that.
Oh, okay, great. So we'll start with this as the first issue
Okay.
next week. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for accommodating me. Bye-bye.
good night.
Good night.